Hey, good morning, everybody. Today's May 7th. We got a bunch of stuff going on today. I had an extremely late start to my day. I have chicken cooking in the oven. We have a Google Meet check in with homeroom and a Google Meet check in with math group today. Hey, Miss Machado, I'm sorry I was late. Miss Machado, blah, blah, blah. You guys have got to be responsible. Seventh grade starts up here pretty shortly, and do you think they're going to be taking your excuses? Probably not. And who knows what the future holds with, look at this hippie hair. Um, who knows what the future holds with how people are going to start up going back to school, but um, we just have to figure out and be responsible for our stuff. Okay, plain and simple. All right, so I'm going to leave off on where I left off yesterday. We were talking about a positives and using DITA as an example. So I'll kind of go back to that. It's only like 3 sentences and then we'll carry on. At least DITA, our radio geek, couldn't find anything wrong with the sets themselves. So we assumed it had to be that. Couldn't contact the other bases, couldn't talk to Jim Bailey. Remember, Jim Bailey's the one that just disappeared. He left. Couldn't contact the other bases, couldn't talk to Jim Bailey out on his own on a ski-doo and ask him what the hell he thought he was doing. At this time, he really was quite, at this time, he really was quite some time. Long enough that something must have happened. Long enough that he'd better either broken down or crashed because he's been gone way too long. And I knew he hadn't broken down because I was the one who looked after the ski-doos and I was good at my job. But then a crash wasn't likely either because there isn't really anything to crash into out there. But this was Jim Bailey. If anyone could find a way of crashing in the middle of a big, flat expanse of featureless ice with nothing to be seen in any direction for miles, then it was him. And if he had crashed or broken down somehow, then most likely he was dead. Because Oates, the place that they were stationed, was the newest and southernmost of the UK Antarctic Survey's bases, and we were too far away from any of the others, or the nearest US base to reach them. But there were a few derelict facilities dotted around the area. So it was just possible that Bailey might have found his way to some hut, some building, half buried in the snow since the 70s or something. And if he'd done that, then it was just possible he might still be alive. So we had to go and look for him. And as the radios were out of action, it was decided that the guy who could fix the ski-doos had better be part of the search party. That was me, and I was not happy. There were 3 remaining ski-doos, so 2 others from the crew went out with me, Ambler and Cole. They were all right, that pair. Knew each other from working together at another base before. Cole was a big fella and funny. Used to sing to himself without realizing he was doing it. He used to. So that means that there's 4 out. Mr. Bailey, who they're looking for, the 3 of them, that leaves 9 left in the shelter. 9 left in the shelter. Ambler was a scrawny looking sort of bloke and a bit of a worrier. Only ever seemed to have time for his work and nothing much else. But, like I say, he was all right. Anyway, we wrapped up warm and we set off. The rest of the crew saw us off, or at least they stood about watching us go out the door. But nobody said very much. I don't think anyone expected it to go well. At least we had a trail to follow. DITA had seen which way Bailey had headed off, and no one else had gone that way lately. So there was a clear set of tracks. And it being the summer after all, the weather wasn't so bad. It was only negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and visibility was good. It wasn't snowing, and that's rare anyway. Apparently, technically speaking, it's a desert out there. It's all about the amount of precipitation, nothing to do with heat. Jim Bailey told me that. I think it's currently kind of, I think it's certainly the kind of thing he would say. Half an hour out from the base, and we realized we didn't need to follow the tracks anymore. Ambler saw it first. Bailey's ski-doo abandoned. And at first glance, there was no obvious damage to it. Close up, it was just the same. I tried the engine. It started the first time. I tried as I expected. There was nothing wrong with it, not a mark on it. The engine just purred beautifully until I turned it off. We took a look around. We are on a flat, featureless plain of blue white ice with good visibility in all directions. A clear view right to the horizon, and we were looking for a man in a bright red coat. If he'd been there, you'd have to figure we'd spot him because it's all white and he's in a red coat. But there was no sign. Who leaves perfectly good who leaves a perfectly good ski-doo and decides he'd rather walk in this place? Cole said. An idiot, I said. Uh-huh. Okay, said Cole, but which way did the idiot go? Are we near anything here? I said. There was an outpost. Ambler was looking at a map and a compass and slowly turning himself around on the spot. Then he stopped turning. Sorry, Montserrat's texting me. Amber was looking at a map and a compass and slowly turning himself around on the spot. Then he stopped turning and looked up, out across the big white nothing, frowning. About 3 miles that way, he pointed. Finnish, geophysicist, and Finnish or scientist from Finland, okay, back in the 70s. But it's likely buried by now, and I doubt Bailey even knew it was there. No, I said, but it's the place we should look. Why? Because if he's anywhere else, then he's dead anyway. Because it's so cold, no food, no nothing. So if they're saying that if he hasn't found a safe shelter and he's walking around out there, he's going to be dead. There was no wind, no sound except our breathing and the crunch of the ice beneath our feet as we shuffled and shifted our weight from side to side, keeping warm or nervous, I'm not sure which. Ambler nodded. Okay, let's go. It took us about 15 minutes on the ski-doos to get to the right spot. 15 more before Cole spotted the nearly buried outpost. The entrance was just visible above the surface of the ice, a slit of darkness gaping up from the whiteness, like the mouth of a drowning man gasping for air. We parked up and looked in. The snow had piled up, forming a natural ramp to the mailbox-sized gap in the small domed building. No answer when we shouted in, and no footprints leading up to the entrance, so we knew there couldn't be anyone in there. But we decided that one of us had to go in anyway, and Cole and Ambler knew each other from before, so I got outvoted. I scrambled up the slope and had to crawl through the gap on my belly because it was so narrow. While I was trying to squeeze through, Cole started giggling, watching me struggling and flailing about, and that set Ambler off, too. Don't think I've ever heard him laugh before. Just a nervous reaction, I suppose, but it made me angry at the time. I was just about to shout at them to shut up when I finally managed to haul myself through and dropped. The snow sloped down sharply inside, so I slid down hard and fast, yelling out in surprise and setting the other two laughing even harder. I came to a standstill with a mouthful of snow, my cheeks burning with cold and embarrassment. I could hear the other two laughing outside. I shouted and swore at them to shut up, but the angrier I got, the harder they laughed. And the harder they laughed, the angrier I got. So eventually I decided to ignore them and get on with what I was supposed to do. There was hardly any light getting through, but it was still enough to see that there was nothing and no one there. It was a nice tiny space, and the Finnish team, the people from Finland, had done a thorough job cleaning it out. I turned the flashlight on anyway and kicked around the snow on the floor for a while just because, well, we'd gone a long way to get there and it just seemed right to take the time. But there really was nothing. I realized as I moved to make my way back out that Ambler and Cole had stopped laughing. But then the silence was broken by another noise, a dull thump, then a quiet cry, then a moment of muffled conversation that I couldn't make out. I shouted, "Hey, all right out there?" No reply. I made my way out again, lumbering up the slope, cursing, and posted myself back out into the light. The glare off the ice did my eyes for a second. Everything was nothing. Then, when I could see, I realized that Amber and Cole were gone. I trudged down the ice slope to where they'd been standing, shouted out their names, no answer, and there were three small splashes of blood on the ice. Then I saw the footprints leading off around the shelter, well spaced, long strides, Ambler and Cole moving quickly, and another drop of blood every few steps. Once I was around the dome of where the building was, so he had to walk around it, I could see them, orange specks on the snow at the end of a line of footprints, too far off for me to shout. They were walking away from me, Cole ahead, walking really purposefully, Ambler behind, waving his arms about as if he was trying to get him to stop. Like, hey, hey. If I'd been thinking straight, I'd have gotten on a ski-doo to go after them. But instead, I ran. Well, not much of a run. The clothing you wear in those parts isn't exactly built for speed. But I took long strides and swung my arms like a child pretending to be a giant or an astronaut bounding about the moon. By the time I caught up with them, Ambler was in front of Cole facing him, bracing himself, ready to physically block his path. He was barely half Cole's size, so he'd struggled to manage it, but Cole had come to a halt anyway. He was hunched over like the air was leaking out of him, and he was staring up at Ambler, looking dazed like he'd just woken up and didn't know where he was. Took a while before anyone said anything. He thought he saw someone, Ambler said to me. He had a thin, bloody, snotty icicle. It's ice because it's so cold, and so the liquid blood froze as soon as it came out, trailing down one nostril over his beard. Bailey? I said. Cole said no. He was staring off into the distance, squinting in confusion, and then wide eyed in surprise. Then he blinked once and turned his head my way, looked me straight in the eyes. It was a boy, he said. I looked at him very closely. I didn't know what to say. It couldn't have been a boy, and Cole must have known that. I know it doesn't make any sense, he said, clear and calm, and still looking me straight in the eye. I know it can't have been, but it was. It was a boy. Maybe 13, 14. I turned my head, looking off over the white expanse in all directions. Obviously, there was no boy, and there was nowhere for a boy to be and not to be seen. But I didn't say anything. He said, I know. I do now. I glanced at Ambler, and he shrugged back at me, at me, overacting it so the gesture was still clear, even though the thick padding of his coat. I pointed at the messy frozen blood in the mustache. What happened? He said, Cole bumped into me when he set off after the boy he says he saw. Kind of headbutted me by accident. So he had a bang on the head? No, said Cole. Well, yes, a bit, but after I saw the boy, it wasn't a concussion, if that's what you're thinking. He scowled. I just saw something impossible that no one else did, that's all. We all stood there for a minute. Ambler wiped the back of his hand like this to get most of the icy, bloody snot to break off of his nose. I said, well, let's get back. And they didn't take any persuading. We walked back to the ski-doos along the trail of our footprints, and there were only our footprints. So they didn't see any little boys' footprints with them. The cold had gotten into us by the time we got back to the base. We trudged up the steps in silence. I was thinking about Bailey, feeling sad about him, but not only sad because I really hadn't liked him. So I also felt guilty about the fact that he was almost certainly dead, as if it's my fault somehow, and I was wondering how the others would take it too. At the top of the steps, the door was open. So they went back to base, and they're at the top of the steps looking down, and the door's wide open. Cole was at the front. He shouted in, "Hey, who left the door open? Were you born in a barn?" He was trying to be funny, trying to sound like his old self, but he didn't. There was no answer. Everyone was gone. We looked really carefully to make sure, especially once we realized that all the cold weather gear was still there. But there really weren't very many places to look. Everyone was gone. So the 9 people that stayed behind are now gone. And they didn't take any of the cold gear to be outside. Everyone was gone and they hadn't wrapped up warm before they went. We ended up in the rec room, like the recreation room. When we spoke, our breath made ghost in the air. Cole said, "What's happening? What happened?" There was no point answering because we'd all run through the same thoughts. Everyone was gone. Everyone had gone outside on foot without cold weather gear for no reason. There was no sign of anything bad having happened, no sign of a struggle, nothing to suggest they were forced to leave. Not that there was anyone for miles around anyway. They just went out. It made no sense. I realized Ambler was speaking to me. "Do you want some?" "What?" I said, "I'm going to make some tea. Do you want some?" Tea? Ridiculous. Normal. I don't know what else to do. "Yes, please," I said, and Cole grunted and nodded. We all shambled into the mess. The mess hall is like where you get your food. No one said anything as the kettle boiled. The switch flicked itself off, and Ambler poured the steaming water into the mugs. We waited silently and staring while the tea brewed, the room still cold from the door being open. Then Ambler stirred sugar into Cole's tea, and the tinkling of the teaspoon in the mug rang out bell like in the silence. Cole and I glanced a thank you at him and handed us our mugs. It was the first time we looked him in the eye in minutes. Then we stood around, warming our hands around the hot mugs. So like this, like, but none of us drinking. Ambler said, "Shouldn't we go out and look for them?" Of course we should. It was the obvious thing, but somehow it was equally obvious that there was no use. We could feel they were gone. We wouldn't find them, nor any trace of them. I looked at Cole. "Tell me about the boy," I said. He looked at me startled. No, wait, not startled, embarrassed, maybe. "There was no boy. Can't have been, can there?" I imagined, must have. He rubbed a palm against the side of his head, squinting and scowling. "I haven't been sleeping well lately. I don't think." "What did you see, Paul?" said Amber softly, touching a fingertip to Cole's shoulder, like he was just very gently adjusting his balance, steadying him. Cole looked down at the floor, breathing very deliberately as if he was concentrating on it. In and out, in and out. Then he looked up at Ambler, eyes wide as saucers. He said, "He was about 12, I should think. It was hard to tell at that distance, but I think so. Blonde hair." Then he looked at, then he shook his head. "That can't be right, can it? Bareheaded out there? And his clothes?" "What?" "Well, he was dressed for winter back home, not like winter here. He had like a short overcoat on and a scarf." He was frowning then, remembering, but not happy with what he was remembering. "I think he was wearing rain boots." "Rain boots?" said Ambler. "Here?" "I know," said Cole, and his voice was crumbling now, breaking apart. "I think maybe." He looked at Ambler. He said, "Am I going mad?" "This boy," I said to Ambler, "did you see anything?" "No." He nodded at Cole. He ran past me like a lunatic and knocked me over. I got up and went after him, but I was only behind him. I couldn't see anything ahead. Then, just as I was catching up to him, he slipped over. I couldn't stop, so I tripped over him. When we got up, there was this gust of wind, kicked up some snow, so it was like a mini blizzard for a second or two. Couldn't see a thing. When it died down, he'd gone, said Cole. I went off in the direction toward where I thought I'd seen him. His voice trailed off, and then he said, I'm scared. He sounded just like a child, and I knew how he felt. When we finally abandoned our cold cups of tea, Ambler tried to persuade us to go back out. Cole and I didn't disagree with him. We just didn't say anything at all, and we didn't move. Well, Ambler lost his temper then, which I'd never seen him do before. I don't think. He shouted at us, pleaded with us, shouted at us again. He said if there was just one chance that the others might still be alive, then we had to go look for them. By this point, Cole was sitting on the floor in the rec room, his back against the wall, hugging his knees. His eyes were squeezed shut, and he was rocking ever so slightly back and forward. I thought maybe he was right. Maybe he was going mad, crazy. And just then, it seemed like a pretty attractive idea to me. Amber finally gave up on us and he headed out on his own, back outside, as if he didn't know what kind of story this is. You don't go out alone. I should have tried to stop him. I could just hear the engine of his ski-doo as he rode off. Cole was still on the floor, rocking and mumbling. I couldn't bear to hear him. I couldn't bear to be near him. Went through the dorm, and the dorm is like where they're at. Um, went to the dorm and climbed into my bunk, his bed. I burrowed down into my sleeping bag, got my head right in, and shut my eyes tight. I wanted it to be dark. I wanted to sleep and make the world go away for a while, but it was still too light, and my head was too full of questions and fear. So I sat up, shaking up Jenny's snow globe, watching the water clear as the white flecks settled to the bottom, then shaking it up again, over and over. In the end, I went back through the rec room. Cole was in the same spot, but at least he'd stopped rocking now. He looked up at me as I walked in. Blank eyes, blank face. I didn't like how he looked, and I wondered if I looked any better. I persuaded him to go play video games with me. Video games weren't really my thing, especially the ones Cole liked, but I wanted something to do with my hands, something unreal to occupy my mind. Literally to occupy my mind, to take up all the space in it and push everything else out, all the negative things that are going on. So we spent 2 hours, 3 hours, four, shooting and slicing and blowing up zombies till we till we must have started to look like them ourselves. And we died and we died and we died. When I accidentally blew us both up by bouncing a grenade off a wall and straight back at us, I got up to go to the bathroom. Cole said, Get food. Okay, I said. As I headed out the door, Cole was standing, stretching, yawning. He glanced out the window. No sign of Ambler, he said flatly. I found all the worst foods in the kitchen and piled up platefuls of delicious unhealthiness for both of us. Cookies, cake, chocolate, potato chips, like food for a child's party, but without the little triangular sandwiches. Then I carried them slowly and carefully, like a tightrope walker, back to the rec room, concentrating hard on not dropping anything. I was shivering with cold before I got back, but I refused to ask myself why. The rec room was empty. The game console had come unplugged from the TV, and the screen was full of white noise like a snowstorm. I heard the plate smashing at my feet, waking me from my daze. I ran to the window. There was Cole wandering off on the ice, walking like a zombie. No coat, no boots, and there was a little squall of snow blowing up just ahead of him, a twirling dance of snowflakes that he was walking straight into. And for a moment, that's my chicken. And for a moment there seemed to be a small shadow ahead of him, a darker shape in the blizzard of white, hard to see at that distance and through a swirl of snow, but it looked like a boy. Hold, please. I'm back. I was stock still, transfixed with a weird tension building within me, a pressure and a sense of panic. I realized I was holding my breath, had been for too long. I breathed out, and the window steamed up the front of my and the window steamed up in front of my face, blocking my view. When I wiped it clean, they were gone. No boy, no coal, no swirling snow, just miles and miles of icy nothingness, and only me in it now. I looked out at it wearily, tired, exhausted. Eventually, a shiver shook me alert enough to close the door. Good idea. Shut everything out. If I sat tight, then the main base would send someone out for me eventually, wouldn't they? If they were still there, I slumped back down close in front of the TV and stared hard at the snowstorm of static on the screen. The random dancing pattern was soothing and hypnotic. I turned the volume up, and the crackle and fizz that went with it drowned out the sound of the wind that was picking up outside, the sound of snow whipped up by the wind, hitting hard against the window. There wasn't normally snow. There shouldn't have been snow, not in the coldest desert on earth. No snow. It was wrong. But at least I couldn't hear it now, and if I didn't look up from the screen, that I wouldn't accidentally look out of the window, wouldn't accidentally see the boy in the snowstorm walking this way. I put one hand on the pocket of my fleece jacket and felt the toy in there, the snow globe, wrapped my fingers around the smooth glass and thought of my sister, thought about home. Distracted my focus, distracted, my focus slipped and the TV snow blurred away to reveal the reflection of my face. Haggard and gray and hollowed eyed, then, hey, reflected. Reflection goes with our math lesson. Then I focused again and my face dropped back behind the curtain of swirling white flecks, and I stared into it. I listened to the static. I didn't hear the outer door opening, and I didn't feel the icy rush of wind. I didn't hear footsteps in the corridor. I turned the TV up loud enough to hurt my ears. I stared at the screen. I stared into the swirling white madness. And then I closed my eyes and waited for the darkness. And I wasn't afraid. Jack's chest felt tight. He realized eventually that this is partly because his arms are wrapped around his body as if he's hugging himself for warmth, though we couldn't tell how much of the cold he feels is real and how much has seeped into him from Mr. Randolph's story. Either way, when he entangles his arms and the tension remains, he wonders for a moment why that is. Then he notices that he is holding his breath. He lets out a small sigh of air and the tension subsides a little, though the cold remains and his breath paints a candlelit smear of mist in the darkness. He looks at Mr. Randolph, who squeezes his eyes shut again, blinking away a subtle tension in his face to regain his natural blank expression. He sits there, still and straight and cold as ice, though no mist plays around his lips, so far as Jack can see. This ought to worry him, he realizes. In fact, a lot of things ought to be worrying him now. Because at some point during Mr. Randolph's story, Jack accepted the inevitable truth of his situation. In fact, he must have known for quite some time. He just hadn't fully admitted it to himself. But now that he has, he's a little surprised that he doesn't feel more scared. He is scared, of course, but somehow he feels removed from it. The fear is just a fact. an inevitable part of him that he feels and observes and examines with quite fascination. It's beyond his control, but it's not overwhelming. Not yet. Thank you, Mr. Randolph, says the pale man, and Mr. Randolph, without a word, not even a hint of an emotion, blows out his candle and pushes back his chair. Jack's heart is racing, and his mind is too. The thoughts and ideas and fears are churning in his head. He stares down at the flame dancing on his stump of a candle. He concentrates, trying to steady himself, the mist of breath mingling with the twisting ribbon of smoke. He swallows down a mouthful of cold air and raises his head again. Mr. Osterley's face is the only one Jack can make out at all now. A pale moon shining in the darkness. Mr. Osterley is still and quiet for a long moment. At last, however, he raises a hand, palm upward, in Jack's direction and smiles. At least Jack thinks he smiles, or perhaps it is only the way the jittering light from the candle is playing on his face. Jack readies himself to speak, wondering if the lump in his throat will allow any words past it all. But then the pale man says, "You shall have the privilege of the final turn, Jack." He lowers his hand, the stuttering light of his dying candle splintering in its slow, smooth movement into the jagged lurches as if it reunites with the others in a loose embrace before him. First, I shall tell my story. So it's just Mr. Osterley and Jack sitting across from each other at the table. Mr. Osterley just says, "You will be able to tell your story last." So now it's Mr. Osterley's turn. But we'll get back to that later. See you shortly for our Google Meet.